The ancient Chinese will help us to understand, and it will affirm many things in the Bible, particularly the book of Genesis. Particularly the book of Genesis. And if Genesis is not true, you can throw the rest of it out, because all the Bible refers back to the beginning. And Jesus referred many times to the beginnings. And sin and salvation mean nothing if there was no creation and no fall and no temptation. You can throw the whole lot out if Genesis is not true. So let's see what the Chinese have to say about Genesis. We're going to touch on 4 areas: creation, the fall, the flood, and the Tower of Babel. And before we do that, we need a crash course in Chinese. There is a mouth. Some people have bigger ones than that. Preachers need mouths like this at times. As the Chinese look at that, and instead of a hieroglyphic, they create what's called a pictogram. And they say, right, that's a mouth, so that's the symbol for mouth, or a person. You know, we say we've got 5 mouths to feed, it means you've got 5 people. You don't have a mouth detached from a person. Or it can mean spoken words. So there it is, and that is a tree, very obviously. And that's 2 trees, or it can be a garden or a forest, depending on the context. So if we put them together, we have a person in a garden. Or we have words spoken in a garden by a person. Depends on the context. Now that you know Chinese, we're ready to go. So let's look at the flood and see what the Bible says here. Noah with his sons, his wife and his sons' wives went into the ark. How many people were there?
8.
Yes. 8 people. The Chinese word for big boat is chuan, or ship. It's not a canoe. The Chinese word for canoe is different. This is a big boat, big vessel, or a ship. If we're talking about the Queen Mary, it's chuan. The Chinese word for Big Ben, the first time it was ever created, is made up of these components: a vessel, zao. The other piece there on the top right of it is the number 8, or ba. And then the rest of it underneath it, you should know what that is. What's that symbol?
8 people in a boat.
8 mouths, 8 people in a boat. The first time the Chinese coined the word big boat, before Moses, before the time when Moses wrote the book of Exodus. The Chinese put 8 people in a boat when they talked about a big boat. And they didn't get it from Genesis. Because Genesis wasn't even written yet. Genesis was written around 1500 BC. Some scholars say 1400 BC. I'm not going to quarrel. Chinese writing goes back 2500 BC. Where did they get this from? Amazing, isn't it? And this is how we're going to progress this meeting. I'm going to peel back using this methodology some of these Chinese characters, and you'll walk out of this church today and you'll treat your faith a lot more seriously than you probably are at the moment. And any doubts that you've got will evaporate. Thank God for the Chinese. Now let's look at something in creation. The word for create, we find that in Genesis 1, God created man. In Psalm it says he spoke and it was done. The Chinese word for create is zao. And it's made up of these components. Word spoken, there's the mouth. Word spoken. And as words were spoken, movement happened. When God spoke, it happened. Living things began to move. This is the ancient Chinese word for create. You say something and it happens. It moves. Now you would have thought if these people did not know the creation story, the word for create would have been making something. A mouth with a hammer and a chisel, creating something. But this is not saying that at all. This is saying as words were spoken, it happened. And that's exactly what the Bible says. God created man, he spoke, and it was done. Isn't that amazing? God formed man from the dust of the ground, we're told. And God breathed into the man's nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. We're familiar with this text. Let me just peel it back in the Chinese and show you how this all lines up. If I take that word Zhao and just look at that top bit, it is made up of dust plus a mouth or man who becomes a living being. And that is buried there in the word create. Not only were words spoken and it happened, but as we take the character apart, we find the dust and breath created a living being just as the Bible says. Isn't that amazing? Where did they get this from? Oh, they got it from Genesis. No, they didn't, because Genesis wasn't even written yet. Now, when we think of China, we think of, well, they're not a Christian country. They're into Taoism. They're into Confucianism. They're into Buddhism. That's what we think, yeah? And the Chinese think, well, Christianity is an American religion. You know, Christianity is George W. Bush. That's what they think. Or they think, well, Christianity is Jewish. But it's not Chinese. This is how the modern Chinese person thinks. Because you go to China today and it's predominantly these religions. But I just want to put this to you. Those three religions I've just mentioned emerged into China around 500 or 600 BC. And I want to ask you this. What sort of God were they worshipping for the first 2,000 years of their civilization? What sort of God were they worshipping from 2500 BC to 500 BC? If those three religions that make China so well known today did not arise until 500 BC. Now, when Moses was crossing the Red Sea with the children of Israel and going through the wilderness experience for 40 years, and then Joshua took over and they entered the Promised Land, while all that was going on, the Shang dynasty was alive and well in China. The Shang dynasty is the first dynasty with actual records and documents. So while Moses and Joshua were there, the Chinese were doing this. And Confucius tells us in his 5 classics, and Sima Qian, the great Chinese historian, tells us in his historical records, the greatest Chinese historian of Chinese history is Sima Qian. And he says that the Shang people worshipped a god called Shang Di. Di just means emperor. Di just means king of kings. They worshipped Emperor Shang. So when you see the word Di, it means supreme being, supreme God, supreme king. And this is what the Chinese letter for Shang Di looks like. They didn't believe in images. They didn't believe in statues of their God. It was all forbidden. They knew it was wrong. But they had a letter for Shang Di. And the word for God or heaven is Tian. And Tian looks like that. And Sima Qian tells us, the greatest historian of Chinese history, that Shang Di is another name for Tian. Any Chinese people here today? Am I pronouncing this right? It's not Tian. That's how the Australians would say it. It's Tien. And Shangdi is another name for Tien. And Tien looks like this. And if I take the top piece off, the word becomes Da, which means anything that is very big is Da. The universe is Da. The sun is Da. A constellation is Da. But when you add that horizontal piece on top, whenever you see that in Chinese and it's the top uppermost horizontal stroke, it means the highest of the high of the high. The word becomes Tian, and it's the Chinese letter for God or heaven, and it means that Tian is bigger and way above anything else that's big. So Tian and Shangdi are the same. And in their thinking, their God was way above anything that they knew of in nature or in the universe. Now we say, oh my God, when something dramatic happens. The typhoon in the Philippines, oh my God. The Chinese say, Tiana. Oh my God, Tiana. The Taiwanese say Tiana. So to them, to the Chinese, Tian is the most high God. And the Bible says, blessed be the most high God. And it uses that term 11 times. Well, the Chinese had that term already. Shangdi is another name for Tian. The spirits do not have two lords, says the historical records. They did not believe in multiple gods, like most pagans. They believed in one God. Most pagans had multiple gods. The Chinese believed in one God. The Bible says the Lord our God is one. So the Jewish people and the Hebrew people were worshipping Yahweh. The Bible is about Yahweh, Jehovah. The Chinese people were worshipping Shangdi or Shangtian. How do we know these are the same? How can we be absolutely sure that Yahweh of the Bible is the same as Shangtian of the Chinese? Now, Confucius unconfuses the whole issue. And in his 5-volume Chinese classics of poetry, there are 175 recitations to Shangdi. I'm not going to read them all. We'll be here till 5. But here are 4 of them. These are extracts from the Confucius classics of poetry, where he's referring to Shangdi. Shangdi is all-powerful. Shangdi has all authority over nations. Shangdi is all-knowing. Shangdi is ever-present, omnipresent, omniscient, supreme being over all nations, all-powerful. Now you might say, well, so what? You've got to remember this. Most pagans did not believe in a God of love. They believed in a God to be feared. And some Christians today still believe in a God to be feared, to be afraid of. The Chinese believed that Shangdi was a God of love. Very unusual for a pagan religion. So I've given you 5 characteristics that are in Confucius' classics of poetry. There are 175 recitations to Shangdi. I've given you 5. And they depict these characteristics of Shangdi. He's holy, he's righteous, he's eternal, he's just, he's gracious, he's faithful, he's wise, he's a God of love, and he's a God of mercy. This is Yahweh. This is Jehovah. They just gave him a different name. Now, Sima Qian tells us that another emperor called Huang Di, worshipped Shang as early as 2500 BC.